Hello and welcome back to High School History. Today we're going to do theme 2 from Themes in Indian History of the class 12 history textbook, and this is called Kings, Farmers and Towns, Early States and Economies circa 600 BCE to 600 CE. The chapter opens with a discussion on Princep and the Piyadassi, where we are told that James Princep is an officer in the East India Company Mint, and he went on to deciphering Brahmi and Kharosthi. In the inscriptions that he deciphered, there is a mention of a king called Devanampiya, meaning beloved of the gods, and Piyadassi, meaning pleasant to behold. And later studies actually revealed that these were the two titles used most commonly for Ashoka. Now, Ashoka is also mentioned in many Buddhist and Jain texts, and here also Devanampiya and Piyadassi titles have been used for him. So, this is what helped us come to this conclusion. There are some references to Ashoka in Brahminical texts as well. Now, the decipherment of Brahmi and Kharosthi also gave a new direction to Indian historiography. Inscriptions and texts in different languages were now used to reconstruct the past, and later there was a shift from just political history to looking at the past and understanding the relationship between political, economic, and social life. When we look at all these old inscriptions and texts, a lot of interesting things begin to emerge. Now, the 6th century BCE is a very interesting period where we see a lot of new developments happening. Now, four of the most important developments of this time were that we see a use of iron. It is an Iron Age civilization. We then look at early states and cities being established. So, this is the second urbanization in India. And by early states here, we mean the 16 Mahajanapadas. This leads to the development of coinage because there is growing trade, not only within the Indian subcontinent, but also far beyond it. And we also see the emergence of heterodox sects like Jainism and Buddhism emerging at this time. Now, when we look at the 16 Mahajanapadas, there are various names that keep coming up in Buddhist, Jain, and Brahmanical texts. But there are some states which are mentioned again and again in each of these sources. So, these are Vaji, Magadha, Koshala, Kuru, Panchal, Gandhar, and Avanti. So these are some of the common names which keep emerging in these texts. So naturally, it gives us a clue that these 6 or 7 states seem to have been the most important. Now, each of these 16 Mahajanapadas had different kinds of political structures. Some were hereditary monarchies like Magadha or Kuru or Panchal Pradesh. Some were Ganas and Sanghas like the Vajjis. Now, each Mahajanapada had a fortified capital. So, these were some of the common features of all of these Mahajanapadas. That most of them would have a fortified capital, they would have an incipient army, not a standing army yet, but an incipient army. They would have a bureaucracy which would, organize statecraft and administration. And you also had taxation emerging at this point of time. We also have the emergence of the Dharma Sutras and the Dharmashastras being, composed by the Brahmins, which laid down the norms for society in general and kings in particular, how kings should behave, how they should take care of their people, and so on. Now, Magadha was first among the 16 Mahajanapadas. So, there were some reasons why Magadha emerged as the most powerful of the 16 Mahajanapadas. First cause could be productive agriculture. Now, Magad was located in close to the Brahmaputra Delta and, of course, along the Ganga Valley. We know that this is the most fertile region of India even today. So, a highly productive agriculture meant that a lot of resources could be raised to actually create a standing army. Magad was the first Mahajanapad to have a standing professional army. So, agricultural taxation was a very important means of creating such an army. Elephants are also found in plenty in this region, and elephants were really the tanks of the ancient and medieval armies. I mean, any army which had a large number of elephants was considered to be almost undefeatable. Magadh region also has a lot of iron mines in the Jharkhand region. Now, iron was the mainstay of the economy in the 6th century BC. Iron was very useful for not only making tools but also for weapons, which would give an edge to the Magadhan army over other armies surrounding them. Cheap transport, cheap and fast means of transport over riverine routes was also a very key factor, because the Magadhans could move their armies up and down the rivers across their kingdoms extremely rapidly. And also, cheap means of transportation also meant that they would have a very lively trade as well. And trade also brought in huge amounts of revenue, which again could be pumped into creating these very powerful standing armies. And another reason that the Buddhist and Jain texts tell us about is that Magad also had a quick succession of ruthlessly ambitious kings. So each of these kings also played a huge role in making sure that Magad emerged as the most powerful of all the 16 Mahajanapads. Magad's first capital was Rajagaha, which was later then shifted to Pataliputra. Now, what are our sources of information about the Mauryas? Now, we have two major categories of sources: archaeological sources, and the second one is literary sources. Now, under archaeological sources, we have a huge range of sources. So, we have epigraphy, or the study of inscriptions, from where we get to know about Ashoka's Dhamma, and what kind of progressive policies that he had for his people, and of course, very importantly, land grants as well, which gave us a glimpse into the economic life and economic structuring of large parts of India. Another very important archaeological evidence is the study of coins or numismatics. As we shall see later in this discussion, that studying the study of numismatics was an extremely important method of trying to rediscover India's ancient past. Among archaeological remains, you may also mention sculptures, some remains of buildings, tools, pottery, and so on and so forth. We will be referring to some of them later in the revision module. We now come to the literary sources. Again, a huge variety of literary sources, which can be further subcategorized as religious and secular. So, under religious texts, you have Jain and Buddhist and Brahmanical texts. And under secular texts, you have the Arthashastra written by Kautilya, which gives us a glimpse into the administration of the Mauryan Empire. And also, most importantly, Megasthenes' Indica. Of course, the book as a whole does not exist anymore, but many other authors quoted from the Indica, and this is how we've gotten to know what Megasthenes thought about India in general. We now come to administration of the empire. Now, both Arthashastra and Megasthenes' Indica provide the base of our understanding of administration in the Mauryan Empire. So, what we get to know is that there were five major political centers which were carefully chosen. These were Patliputra, which was the capital of Magad across many dynasties, Takshila in the northwestern part of India, which was also part of the Silk Route, Ujjaini, which was again a very important city along the overland trade route which led to the southern part of India, Toshali, and Suvarnagiri. Now, Suvarnagiri was in the southern Deccan, where you have the Karnataka gold mines. So perhaps Suvarnagiri was also carefully chosen because of its proximity to gold mines. Uh, when we look at Ashokan inscriptions, we see the same inscriptions scattered across the subcontinent. But given the primitive means of transport and communication, most scholars today agree that the extent of the empire might have been quite large, but it was not a centralized empire. There had to be some decentralization. Perhaps administration was strongest in and around these five political centers. But as you moved away from these centers, perhaps imperial control weakened. Now, Megasthenes' Indica mentions, among a lot of other things, six subcommittees for coordinating just military activities. So there was one committee organizing the navy, another to organize transport and provisions. This was, of course, a very varied committee because it had to look at, different means of transportation to be provided, how to procure food, servants and craftsmen and all to fulfill the requirements of a large moving army. There was the third subcommittee looked after the needs of the foot soldiers. The fourth one looked after horses and procurement of horses. Then there was another committee to look after chariots, building them, repairing them, and so on. And the final committee looked after the procurement and care of elephants of the Magadhan army. Now let's come to Ashoka's Dhamma. Now, when we look at Ashokan inscriptions and we try to figure out the principles of his Dhamma, they were pretty simple and they were universally applicable. For example, he talks about respecting parents, practicing non-violence. So this is something which would be universally applicable to anyone. Yes, also something like uh, tolerance towards people who do not follow the same religious values as you do. um, then most of these principles were geared towards ensuring the well-being of the people. Ashoka in his inscriptions also talks about special officers that he had appointed called Dhamma mahamatta, who would go from city to city, from village to village, and spread the message of his Dhamma. Now, how important was this concept of the empire? Now, in the 18th and 19th centuries, when not just the British scholars but also Indian scholars were looking at India's past, the idea of a large empire was very exciting, especially in the context of the fact that when the British colonialists were telling us that we were unsuitable for ruling ourselves, and which is why the British had come to civilize us. So when you discover an empire as large as Ashoka's, and his benevolent rule over his empire, it sort of gave the Indian nationalists a chance to find a hero, and reply to the colonial historiography and say that no, we also had a very well established system of administration and benevolent despotism, and it was not all chaos as the British were telling us at that time. Archaeological finds that were emerging right now, especially Ashoka's pillar inscriptions, which were highly polished and works of art, or the stupas, they were extremely refined and artistically beautiful. So that also gave the nationalist historians, a chance to argue that India's past was very glorious. The modern empire only lasted 150 years. I mean, 150 years seems like a long time to you and me, but when you look at the entire extent of Indian history, 150 years is a very short time. Also, the modern empire did not encompass the whole of India. It was only during Ashoka's reign that large parts of the subcontinent were brought under his rule. But then again, the extreme northeast and extreme south were never really under the direct control of Ashoka. So, really, in political terms, perhaps the modern empire does not have a lasting impact, but definitely the legacy in terms of organization of administration, of Ashoka's Dhamma, and the whole idea of an India-wide empire, that definitely left behind an interesting legacy. Let's now talk about the new notions of kingship. If we go to southern India, we see that we have a lot of chiefdoms and kingdoms in the southern part of the country, especially the Cholas, Cheras, and Pandyas in what is known as the ancient Tamilakam region. Now, Tamilakam included parts of southern Karnataka, in fact, even southern Maharashtra, Karnataka, Andhra Pradesh, Kerala, and Tamil Nadu. We also have the Sangam texts, which form a very important source of information for the chiefs and the kings of southern India, especially when compositions from the Sangam text tell us about how rulers acquired and distributed wealth by raiding neighboring areas. The Shakas and Satvahanas were also important dynasties to rule in central and western India. Their origins were largely obscure, and not only them, but a lot of other dynasties, which were perhaps not Kshatriyas, they tried to claim legitimacy through various means. One of the most powerful ways to do that was to claim divine origin. Yes, so Kushanas would build these colossal statues, and they would identify with various deities by picking up titles like Devaputra, meaning the son of God. Guptas, of course, not only took up high sounding titles like Maharaja Adhiraj, but also gave land grants to Samantas, who were in turn loyal to the rulers. The kings also got prashastis composed for themselves. Prashastis were these, hyperbolic, high praise poems, which were composed by court poets of these kings. One of the most outstanding examples of prashastis is a Prayag Prashasti, which describes Samudragupta as one of the most powerful kings, who's equal to Indra, who's equal to Varuna, who's equal to Yama, the god of death, in his power, and he's rich as Kuber and so on, right? So these were different ways in which the kings were trying to claim legitimacy, especially if they had overthrown a previous dynasty and their own origins, were less than elite. We now move on to the rural areas of the period under study. And first, let us talk about how did the common people view the king. Now, commoners have left behind almost no records. Most of the information that we get are from oral traditions like the Panchatantra and the Jataka stories. So your text mentions the Gandatindu Jataka, which talks about a king who, changes, who sort of goes out to the villages in disguise to find out how his subjects are faring. And when he goes from village to village, every category of people, whether it's old people, children, young people who are working in the fields, men or women, even animals, they all complain to the king that, of course, not knowing that he's the king, but they all complain that we are robbed by the robbers at night, but the king's tax collectors come and rob us during the daytime. So obviously they were protesting the taxes, which were much hated. And the same Jataka also talks about how the peasants then ran away, from their fields, abandoned their fields, and went and hid in forests. So this is also a very interesting, idea that gets thrown up, that the peasants did not always have very direct ways of protest, but abandoning your fields and hiding in the forest was actually very powerful, because if they leave their agrarian fields, there is no production. So where is the king going to get his taxes from? So the king had to be careful about how much taxes he was forcing the people to pay. Of course, one of the methods, as you saw, of the peasants of avoiding taxes was running away. But often peasants were also looking at strategies to increase production so that they could pay the taxes better. The first among that is introduction of plough agriculture in the Gangetic plains, though hoe agriculture continued in the more arid and hilly areas. Now, the iron tipped plough was also a great innovation, because when you look at the soil in the Gangetic plains, the soil tends to get very hard in the dry months. And it's actually in the dry months that the farmers are supposed to plough their fields. So, the iron tipped plough became heavy and was able to turn the soil better. Helping increase fertility of the soil and therefore yield. Transplantation of paddy was another excellent innovation. This made sure that the paddy plants had a better chance of survival and therefore increasing the yield of rice. The fourth strategy was, of course, irrigation through wells, tanks, and canals. And we also see that, often the ruling dynasties would also help in building and repairing tanks and canals, because tanks and canals were huge projects which individuals or even small village groups found it difficult to undertake. So we have references, quite a few inscriptions that we find around the country, which talk about one king getting a tank constructed or a canal constructed, and maybe many generations later by a king of another dynasty, that tank or that canal is repaired. So we see how important irrigation was in Indian agriculture. Now, we've talked about these new technologies, and we also know that technology always results in unequal benefits. So some farmers were able to gain more from these technical innovations than other farmers, which therefore led to differences in rural societies. So when we look at Buddhist texts, it talks about three categories of peasants: the landless laborers, the small landholders, and the large landholders. Now, the Buddhist texts use a term called Gahapati to signify any landholder or householder. When we look at the Sangam texts, they also mention three categories of rural population: the Adimai or the slaves, the Uzavar or the plowmen, and the Velalars or the landowners. Now let's look at land grants and how that creates a new rural elite. Now we have a lot of copper plate and stone inscriptions which mark out land grants. Often these inscriptions are also bilingual, Sanskrit and perhaps a local vernacular language. Many of these grants have been made to religious institutions and to Brahmins. These grants range from small plots to large tracts which were being donated by kings or by very rich people. And when we look at these land grants, they give us the text of the land grant, the content of the land grants. They give us a glimpse of rural life and what dues had to be paid by the villagers to now this new Doni who had been given this land by the king. Now, when we talk about land grants, we have to talk about Prabhavati Gupta. Now, Prabhavati Gupta, we know, donates land. We found some inscriptional evidence that Prabhavati Gupta was donating land to not only temples but also to learned Brahmins. Now, Dharmashastras, of course, tell us that women cannot own land. So, how is Prabhavati Gupta donating land if she doesn't own any? Now, Prabhavati Gupta was an exception. She was an extremely powerful woman. She was the daughter of Chandragupta II, one of the most powerful kings of the Gupta dynasty. She was married to the Vakataka king of the Deccan, and after her husband's death, she was also the regent to her son. So she really was an exceptional woman, and therefore, you know, uh, her land grants are considered so exceptional by historians. Perhaps Prabhavati Gupta making land grants also indicates that the Dharmashastras were not always followed in every part of India. Now, the question is, why were these land grants given? Now, scholars uh, argue different points. Uh, s- some of them argue that this was a strategy to extend cultivation to new lands. So, hitherto, virgin lands were brought under cultivation, which obviously would mean that the king would be able to gain more. Sometimes land grants were given by kings to win allies. Others gave land grants to legitimize their rule, especially if they had usurped power from another dynasty. Other scholars argue that maybe giving the act of giving land grants was like presenting a facade of power if the king was growing weak. We see it, especially the land grants which are given during the later part of the Gupta rule. Um, the kind of language that is being used seems very hyperbolic. So scholars are assuming that because the kings at this point of time were in a weaker position vis-a-vis their samantas, they were kind of announcing that, okay, I'm giving this land grant as a way of showing that I'm still very powerful. We now come into towns and look at trade. New cities are emerging, commercial centers, administrative centers. Often they are located along important trade routes. So we have Puhar, which is a coastal town. A lot of shipping activity takes place from here. We have Ujjaini, as I've already mentioned earlier. It was along an important land trading route which connected southern and northern India. We had Mathura, which was right at the center of the Indo-Gangetic plains, and Takshila, which connected India to the larger Silk Route. What were urban populations like? So there was a mix of both elite and craftspeople. We have found NBPW or Northern Black Polished Ware Pottery, which was a very fine grade of pottery. So perhaps this kind of pottery was being used, by the richer people living in the city. We have also found evidence of a large variety of goods made with different kinds of materials. So you have tools, weapons, jewelry, which were made of iron or copper, bronze, silver, shell, gold, and so on. We also have a lot of donor inscriptions, especially to temples, which mention washing communities, washing folk communities, weavers, scribes, carpenters, potters, goldsmiths, blacksmiths, officials, religious teachers, merchants, and even kings. We also have evidence of shrenis or guilds, craft guilds or trade guilds, which organized and regulated production and the quality of the production. And on the other hand, they also looked after the needs of the members as well. Indian trade was quite widespread, not only within the Indian subcontinent but also far beyond. They traded in all directions. So we had trade links with Central Asia. In fact, they connected us to Europe as well, Southeast Asia, North Africa, and China. In Sangam texts, we find successful merchants are designated as Masattuvan in Tamil and Settis and Satvahas in Prakrit. and these merchants could grow to be enormously rich. Now, the items of trade were also mind bogglingly varied, but we can only name a few here. So, salt, grain, cloth, metal ores, finished products, stone, timber, medicinal plants, spices, especially pepper, was very highly demanded in the Roman Empire. Now, when we're talking about long distance trade, we have to talk about monetization or emergence of coins, because it is coins or currency that really facilitates, you know, uh, trade over long distances and also trade in high value items. So, the earliest punchmark coins that we find are uh, made in silver and copper. They facilitated trade and exchange. And when numismatists study coins, where coin hoards are found, they help us mark out commercial routes of those times. We have coins not only issued by kings but also merchants and bankers guilds, and even tribal republics like the Yodhayas were minting their own coins. The Indo-Greeks issued the first coins with names of kings on them, and later on this practice was adopted by different Indian dynasties as well. The first gold coins were issued by the Kushanas and later the Guptas. The Kushana gold coins were almost of the same weight and value like that of the Indo Greek coins. Now, gold coins indicate enormous value of trade over long distances. We found a lot of coin hoards, which may reveal, which were important centers of exchange, how the routes were mapped out. But as we move further in this period, we see that by the 5th and the 6th century CE, we find less coins. Now, what does that mean? Does that mean that empires were in decline and they didn't have enough money to mint gold? They didn't have enough gold sources to mint gold coins? Other scholars have argued that perhaps they were in circulation, and maybe the empires were stable, which is why the people did not have to, hoard and hide the money. There are yet other scholars who say that maybe the trade routes had changed and we have not discovered those new trade routes. So perhaps an accidental find of coin hoards will actually redefine trade routes in the past. Right through this chapter, we have talked about inscriptions and how they form such an important source of information, of understanding the past. But all these inscriptions were written in scripts which were long lost. Now, how did we manage to decipher these inscriptions, especially Brahmi and Kharosthi? Now, for long, European scholars and Indian pundits had been working together to try and figure out what these inscriptions said. So they started working backwards from Devanagari and Bengali script and tried to say, okay, how would these are there any similarities? Have similar looking characters kind of evolved into what we see today in Devanagari and Bengali. So all this groundwork was laid when finally James Princep was able to decipher Brahmi in 1838. Now, Kharosthi also has an interesting story. Now, James Princep also began to look at the northwestern part of the Indian subcontinent as well, and there was a new script that was found, which was Kharosthi. Now, how did we manage to decipher Kharosthi? We found Indo Greek coins which were bilingual. So they would have Greek and Kharosthi. So it was now just a matter of replacing one with the other. So if the name of the king Apollodotus was written in Greek, you kind of found parallels of the syllable A, P, and so on, right? And this is how Kharosthi was deciphered. Now, what kind of historical evidence can we glean and extrapolate from inscriptions? The first most powerful thing, of course, that inscriptions did for us was, help us rediscover Ashoka. The knowledge about Ashoka had been lost over time. But when James Princep was able to read the Brahmi inscriptions and he saw that most of these inscriptions, the pillar ones especially, are largely saying the same thing. The language is very similar, the content and the style is similar, and even the structure of the alphabets, which is called palaeography, indicated that many of these inscriptions were being issued by the same ruler, namely Ashoka. Now, when we handle inscriptions, there are a few things we need to keep in mind. The scholars need to judge whether the inscription is giving you a literal truth, or is it exaggerating facts? Often, epigraphists will add brackets to indicate missing words either due to damage or to make proper sense without changing the actual meaning. The location of inscriptions is also very important, especially when we look at Ashokan inscriptions. They are largely found along important trade routes so that maximum people could access these inscriptions and read. So, Ashoka's message would be spread far and wide across his empire. Also, what is interesting is in this context, when we look at the Kalinga inscription and we see how terribly sad Ashoka is, and he's really regretting launching a war against Kalinga. But interestingly, this inscription is found nowhere in Kalinga. Now, is it because there were those inscriptions but they've been destroyed since? Or was it that even during the lifetime of Ashoka, the situation in Kalinga remained fairly sensitive, and Ashoka did not want to complicate matters, by putting up an inscription like that? Or the Kalingans might have just said, well, okay, if you're regretting killing us so much and harming us so much, you might as well just leave this place. And I guess Ashoka would not want to, give up any part of his empire. Now let's talk about the limitations of inscriptional evidence. What are the problems of handling inscriptional evidence? The first is technical. So there could be that letters are faintly engraved, so you can't really make out what is written. Or maybe the inscription has been damaged, so part of the text is missing. Maybe inscriptions themselves are missing, we haven't found them. Often meanings change over time, right? The syntax changes over time. Words begin to mean very different things over time. So the translations that we have of the inscriptions, are they accurate, is a question that we need to keep asking ourselves. There are some other kinds of problems also. For example, of all the inscriptions that have been found, only a fraction have been deciphered. Many inscriptions are lost. Inscriptions only record spectacular events or royal edicts, but the inscriptions hardly ever give us a glimpse into the day-to-day life of common people. So information about the common people can only be extrapolated perhaps from donation inscriptions in temples, or through land grants, when they are just mentioned in passing. So, with this, we come to the end of the chapter. I hope this module was useful for you. If you found it relevant and helpful, don't forget to click on the thumbs up button, and do subscribe to this channel so that you can get updates whenever I'm putting up a new video. Wishing you all the best for your exams. Here is high school history wishing you bye bye.